Experimenting with reptiles seems rough, but what if we need to? What if we don't actually know all we need to know about reptiles from the care guides that are on the internet? What if we need to experiment and learn ourselves? Today we're going to discuss that. My name's Adam, this is Diamond, you're watching Wickens Wicked Reptiles. Stick around. To be clear, I'm not talking about experimenting with veterinary medicine if you're not a vet, okay? What I'm talking about instead, we seem like we are growing. Because if you watch a 1980s care guide or read one, I guess there was no YouTube then, it's gonna tell you things for bearded dragons like you can't keep them on loose substrate because they're going to die. It tells you in some of these care guides that they need enclosures that are 20 gallons. So obviously we learn and we experiment and we know better. And I think a great example of this, I was watching the Animals at Home podcast a few months ago. I am so sorry I forget the episode. I'll put it here if I can remember. And they were talking about how leopard geckos in part of their range experience very wet periods of the year. And when they go and study them for extended periods of time, they find that the elevated humidity is kind of changing their, not only their breeding behavior, but just their behavior in general. So what if we need to give leopard geckos much more humid periods during certain times? What if we could just experiment and find out? Now we do have guys like Dave Kaufman who do a great job when they'll go out and do their series. Are we keeping them correctly in the wild? The only issue with this, well, there's not even an issue. I just think that we need to remember that Dave is going for a week or 2 weeks or maybe 3 weeks, but he's not doing these extended periods of study. So if he says, oh, this Aki burrow is this temperature, he's not saying to you, well, you must keep yours this much different than the care guide. He's suggesting this is what it was on this day, just to give you an insight of what it's like to actually see them in the wild. Just like when I went to Costa Rica with the Peepa Squad, right? Dion and Mike Taitula, and we saw that there was so much leaf litter in the area of the Dendrobates auratus. I think it's pretty safe to say we can just give them more leaf litter. It's not going to change too much. But we also saw that the UV reading was like, I don't know, some crazy high number that we would never give to a dart frog. And parts of that area were 90 degrees that day. Because they are so bold, and we actually found this guy in the sun with a UVI reading of something like 7. Unbelievable. That doesn't mean we're going to start changing everything and start keeping our dart frogs at 90 degrees. That animal's going to be in the shade most of the day. We just happen to find it crawling across a sunny shade of grass. So yes, it's okay to work with temperatures and humidity. I think it's the first thing we should talk about, but not to a degree where you're going to get the animal sick. Keep an eye on the animal. So for example, if you have a leopard gecko, give them an enclosure that is much larger than you normally would, say 50 gallons as a minimum to practice, to study them, I would say, which is what I do. 3 feet by 1.5 feet by a foot tall or taller. And give them an area where it's very, very humid and an area where it's as dry as normal. And you can do this by giving them a very big Tupperware container with kind of their own micro habitat inside of there. So you're kind of setting up the two basically the exact same way, and kind of do that for a year and see how during the course of the year, if they use that humid hide more than they use the dry hide, or give them 2 big enclosures connected with a tube, something like that, where you're not sacrificing what we know now to be correct for what we think might be correct, because there's a lot of times we think we know and we're wrong. What happens if you jack up that leopard gecko's enclosure to 70% humidity for 2 weeks because, you know, in the wild you see that, and all of a sudden gets a respiratory infection and croaks? You don't want that to happen either. So just be careful is going to be the kind of sentiment through this entire video, but changing humidity and temperature requirements is something that we've done before. We used to keep Akis and Savannah monitors way cooler, where now we know their basking temperatures are crazy high. And I experiment with my Aki too. I give him tons and tons of areas, or her rather, tons and tons of areas where she can choose to bask, and where she chooses to bask the most often, that's where I'm gonna make a bigger basking area at that temperature. Or about things like enclosures, the type of enclosure you use, the size that you use, covering just the sides versus not covering the sides. For example, we used to keep bearded dragons in enclosures that were 40 gallons. Now we know that's ridiculous. You would never keep a bearded dragon in a 40 gallon unless you were the silliest goose of all the silly gooses to ever be a silly goose. We know that's not okay now. Even 75 gallons are too small. 120 minimum, 4x2x2. This is pretty standard practice now. And I think that before we used to say, oh, well, you need a screen top to keep the humidity down. But now I use PVCs and they work just fine as long as you use a basking bulb to dry out the enclosure. I mean, you would do that anyway, but we've seen in practice where I live in what's basically a swamp, right? The southern Ontario region of Canada, it's 70% humidity outside right this second. And in that enclosure, it's 44% humidity. So maybe a little bit elevated, but in the winter, it can get down to the point where I need to worry about it being too low because I've got the furnace on and it's drying everything out. So even though I have a misting system and I'm misting the crap out of everything else because I got frogs in here, the bearded dragon enclosure sometimes will get to like 20% humidity, sometimes even lower on that side. So I think you can experiment with things like enclosure sizes and things like that. And honestly, I kind of want to give my bearded dragon a little bit bigger of an enclosure. I think diamond would do really well in an enclosure that was 4 feet high, because in the wild, you're going to find them on fence posts and tree stumps and things like that, where they're going to be off the ground pretty significantly. On enclosure size, we now know, ball pythons, a lot of people, Els Reptiles did a great video about this, about how she gives a 6-foot long enclosure to her ball pythons now. I give 4-foot enclosures, and now that it's been a couple years, I agree. I'm not saying that you should or you have to, but when I upgrade, I'm gonna be keeping ball pythons in 6-foot enclosures. They use all of the space if you set it up correctly, every single one of them, and I'm talking about dozens and dozens that I've witnessed. So I know that you're gonna read, oh, well, mine are in a rack and they never move, and okay, is it a coincidence that literally dozens of mine have used all the space I provide? No, it just means that there's a difference in the way that you set up the enclosure. You want these animals to act and explore. Dave Kaufman just did a whole video about how he finds these things out of burrows and sometimes in trees and things like that. So yeah, they're gonna do more than just be in a termite mound their entire life. And again, the only way to know is to experiment. I mean, I've kept things in racks, ball pythons, and I've kept them in 4x2. They always eat better, they act better, always, in the enclosures that I set up. And if you wanna know how I do it, because you're thinking, he might be onto something, there's wherever the thing pops up. I did a whole video how I set my enclosures up. Or what about something as simple as diet? I mean, a lot of the time people are gonna feed their ball pythons just rats. And that's fine. They can live perfectly healthy lives, but I've done something kind of cool. I feed them quails sometimes. Because in the wild, during certain parts of the year where it's really kind of, I guess, waterlogged on the ground, and they're gonna be in trees, you're likely going to find them eating things like birds. Or for example, people always say African soft furs. Again, I'm gonna poach Dave's information from his video again. He went there, they didn't have a freaking clue, because African soft furs aren't real animals that are in the wild in Africa. So no, they don't eat these. But it doesn't mean that feeding them African soft furs is a bad thing. Sometimes diversifying diet is something that is going to stimulate their brain. So I don't think at all. I think that the best way is to experiment within reason. I wouldn't go start feeding frogs to your ball python. That's not really something that we've ever observed them eating in the wild, well, as far as I know anyway, is a staple of their diet, maybe on an off chance. And also we know that rodents do really well, and we know that quails do really well from years of experience, so maybe chicks too. Like, just feed them something that makes sense. And that brings us to the most sensational one that I've done videos on before, cohabbing. I am a big fan of cohabbing animals in an appropriate and conservative way. By conservative, I mean, don't do too much too fast. So I keep my cherry heads together, I keep a whole bunch of frog species together, but I'm talking about multi-species cohabs. And in the past, I've only done this a few times. I do this currently, and I've done a whole video about it up here with frog species and gecko species. So I have Madagascar giant day geckos, the Thalsumas, and I have them with Amazon milk frogs. Will they ever experience each other in the wild? No. One is from Central and South America, and one is from Madagascar, so definitely not. But they are very similar in the way that they need to be cared for. Their diets are similar enough, right? They both eat insects. They both are arboreal, temperature, humidity. They're big enough each where they're not going to predate on each other, and they're not going to fight with each other. And I've done this for long enough that I feel very confident in saying this is possible if you do your research and observe. And also the pet store that I go to, the Reptile shop, they do this too, and they've never had issues also. So it's not something that I just kind of out of left field you have to do a little bit of thought. Always put a lot of thought into what you're about to do, because if you just go and mix this with this, it's probably not going to end well. But maybe the one that I've seen other people do, and I'm going to try myself. I have my cherry heads. They're outside for the summer, but I live in Canada and the summer is coming to a quick close. And any day now I might have to bring them in because it's too cold and it's not going to warm up enough again. So I want to put them in something that is big, something that's maybe, okay, where were we? The camera shut off because it's warm. Anyway, I think that I want to keep these animals in something bigger. I want to keep my redfoot tortoises in something bigger, something that's maybe 8 foot long, 4 foot across, but I only have so much room in this room. So what if I were to cohabit with something else that has more space than needed? What if I were to cohabit these guys with something that occurs in their native range, like a boa constrictor? Now this might seem crazy. I'm not a pioneer if I try this. And I've kind of set it up so that it can. I built a jungle gym for Franny last weekend with my dad. I want to give her more opportunities. There's some hides and branches missing just because I wanted to show how big this enclosure was and so it didn't look cluttered. And I'm going to give this animal an option so that she has a water dish up high. She's going to be nocturnal, where the tortoises are going to be diurnal. The tortoises can't get up above, so they're not going to be able to poke at her and peck at her and bite her. And she's not going to have any interest in eating the turtles. So we're going to give it a try. But here's what I would recommend. Observation always. Like, observe like crazy. Even if you were to put them together for a small, short time, have a backup plan. I do have an enclosure that I used to keep the tortoises in. It was just a little bit too small in my opinion. And giving them 8x4 is just better, I think. So I'm gonna provide UVB, the basking spots. There's gonna be several of them. There's gonna be some up high for the snake. If the snake does come down low, she's gonna have the option to get away from these animals. So it's something that I'm going to try. Let me know in the comment section, is this silly goose stuff? What would you recommend? I wanna hear your opinion. But at the end of the day, the way that I'm going to do it is introduce them slowly, right, to experiment and see how they react to each other, and then maybe take them out for the night, maybe keep them a little bit longer, have a monitor available too. Like, I have cameras all over the place, so I can literally look at them all over the place. So if I'm sitting at my desk for 8 hours editing a video, I can literally have the camera right there, like I do with my front door. I can see my front door. If you walk up to it, I can see it from my desk. Same sort of idea. So I think we need to experiment with animals in order to continue, but do it in a very conservative fashion. Don't go too far, and a very responsible fashion as well. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. If you don't mind, hit that like and thumbs up button. It helps more than you could ever imagine. And as always, a special thanks to the Patreon supporters. You guys know about the trips that we're going on. You get discounts on the merch, extra videos. You know about, there's a really cool thing happening over here. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and you'll get the Reptile Room tour soon. That's it. Because I do videos on Mondays and Thursdays, that means I'll see you in the next one.